welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
So today, we're diving into Somalia's political transition, but through a very specific lens.
That's right. We're focusing on a paper by Abdullahi Mohuddin Hassan Abdullahi Yabaro. He's a legal researcher, master of law.
And his paper offers a particular perspective, using this really striking metaphor.
Yeah, the dead horse theory. It's central to his whole analysis of what's been happening.
Okay, let's unpack that. The dead horse theory.
Yeah.
What exactly is it, according to the source, and how does it relate to Somalia's past?
Well, the paper traces it back to Dakota tribal wisdom.
Okay.
And the idea is pretty simple, really. If the horse you're riding dies,
Huh?
well, the sensible thing is to get off.
Right. Stop putting effort into something that's clearly not going anywhere.
Exactly. It's about recognizing futility and moving on.
And the paper takes this image and applies it to Somalia's historical political setup. That sounds pointed.
It is quite pointed, yeah. For, over 20 years, Somalia used an indirect electoral system?
So not people voting directly.
No, it was more like clan elders, various intermediaries. They selected the members of parliament.
And then those MPs chose the president, the executive.
Correct. And the paper's argument is that this system, despite, being around for so long, it fundamentally failed. It didn't bring stability, didn't create accountability. It was, in the paper's view, a dead horse.
Why dead, specifically?
Yeah.
Because it excluded people.
That's a huge part of it.
Yeah.
The vast majority of Somalis were just, left out of the process.
Mm-hmm.
It kept power in the hands of a small elite, and according to the source, it just couldn't deliver what the country needed.
Yeah.
No matter the tinkering, it wasn't working.
Okay, so that's the past system, is the dead horse.
Yeah.
But the paper argues something has changed recently, that Somalia is dismounting.
Yes, exactly. That's the shift the paper focuses on. It says Somalia has started to get off the dead horse.
How so? What's the key action?
It points to the federal parliament. The paper describes it as the sole national body with real legal and representative authority. And this parliament took a landmark step. They enacted legislation for direct elections. One person, one vote.
And critically, the paper stresses this came from inside Somalia.
Absolutely. It wasn't pushed from the outside, according to this analysis. It came out of their own legal processes, their own debates.
Reflecting a demand from the people.
That's the argument, a collective desire for, actual democracy, real participation, Somalia taking charge of its direction.
Does the paper give any, concrete examples of this public demand?
It does. It talks about thousands of people, especially in Mogadishu, actively registering to vote.
Even with challenges. Security, resources.
Yeah, despite all that. The paper suggests their motivation is a genuine belief in having a direct say through the ballot box.
And why single out Mogadishu?
Well, the source highlights its unique position. It's apparently the only city consistently providing federal tax revenue.
Ah, okay. Funding the government.
Pretty much. So the argument is those residents especially deserve direct representation given their contribution.
Okay, so internal momentum towards direct democracy. Somalia dismounting, but then the paper looks at the international reaction, and it's critical.
Very critical. This is where the other part of the metaphor comes in, flogging a dead horse.
Meaning trying to beat life back into the old, failed system.
Precisely. The paper observes that some parts of the international community have had a kind of subdued reaction to these internal democratic moves.
Subdued how?
Well, the source points to official statements emphasizing things like dialogue, consensus, inclusivity.
Which sound good on the surface.
Theoretically, yes, but the paper argues that in Somalia's specific context, these terms have often been used in a way that actually empowers unelected elites.
At the expense of the elected parliament.
Exactly, at the expense of the legitimate institutions that are trying to move forward.
So when international actors call for bringing all stakeholders to the table, how does the paper interpret that term, stakeholders?
According to this source, stakeholders often ends up being a sort of code, a euphemism for bringing back former presidents, former prime ministers, former MPs.
People from the old system who don't currently have a mandate from voters.
Correct. Unelected figures. And the paper argues that pushing for their inclusion in consensus talks is essentially trying to prop up the old, failed system.
That's the flogging. Persisting with strategies tied to the dead horse.
That's the paper's core argument there, yes. It's seen as counterproductive diplomacy.
The paper actually uses specific examples from the original dead horse theory sayings to illustrate this flogging, doesn't it?
It does. It draws direct parallels, like buying a stronger whip.
Okay, how does that translate to Somalia, according to the paper?
The paper argues it's like when external actors insist on including these unelected figures in the political process over and over.
And that's like using a stronger whip because
The paper says it undermines the actual elected parliament. It messes up the timelines for the new election laws, slows down reform. It's trying to force the old broken system to work by just applying more pressure.
Right, hitting the dead horse harder isn't going to make it run. What about reclassifying the dead horse as living impaired?
Yeah. The paper connects that to how the term inclusivity is sometimes used.
How so?
The argument is that inclusivity gets invoked to legitimize bringing back these political figures who don't have current electoral backing.
So it's like relabeling the problem instead of fixing it, pretending the horse isn't really dead.
That's the interpretation in the source. It's seen as a way to sort of cosmetically preserve elements of the defunct system rather than fully moving on, using positive language to mask the propping up of the old guard.
Okay, and the last one mentioned is appointing a committee to study the horse.
Yeah, the paper sees a pattern here too. It notes that often when electoral terms are ending, some international partners push for more negotiations, more talks.
Instead of just letting the elections happen according to the new laws.
Exactly. Instead of sticking to the constitutional calendar and the laws passed inside Somalia.
And the paper views these calls for endless talks as the committee.
It argues that these interventions, whatever the intention, often just lead to delays. Delays that end up protecting the status quo, benefiting the insiders and unelected players from the old system.
So it's like studying the dead horse instead of burying it and getting a new one.
That's the analogy the paper draws. It delays real change and empowering the actual voters.
So the picture the paper paints is this strong public push for direct voting, for legitimacy through the ballot box.
Yeah, real energy from citizens wanting a direct say.
Contrasted with what the paper sees as unhelpful interference from some outside actors trying to manage the process differently.
That's the central tension highlighted. And the paper is quite specific about which actors it sees as interfering in this way.
Okay, who does the source name? We should be clear, this is according to the source paper.
Yes, absolutely. The paper mentions the U.S. and U.K. embassies and also representatives from the UN mission, UNSOM. Specifically, the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General, the SRSG.
And what negative impacts does the paper claim their actions are having?
The source argues these diplomatic practices undermine the reforms Somalia's own institutions are trying to implement by inadvertently giving legitimacy and influence to unelected opposition groups and basically blocking or slowing down the implementation of the election laws passed by Parliament.
And this brings us back to that idea of inclusivity being used strategically.
Right. The paper argues that in this context, the push for inclusivity isn't always about broad fairness, but sometimes becomes a tactic.
A tactic to do what?
To reinsert these former political figures, the ones without a current popular mandate, which, the paper says, just reinforces the old elite, control the dead horse system, and makes people more cynical.
Okay, so all of this leads the paper to make a strong argument about sovereignty, doesn't it?
A very strong argument. It insists that for Somalia's transition to succeed, its sovereignty has to be respected.
Meaning its institutions need space to work.
Exactly. The parliament, the government. They need the autonomy to implement the laws they've passed without constant external pressure to renegotiate or bring back elements from the failed past.
Let the new system breathe, essentially.
And that's the idea. Trying to graft parts of the dead horse onto the new vehicle, the paper says that just won't work.
So what does the paper consider helpful international engagement? Is there a role?
Yes, it suggests constructive support is welcome, but it has to be support that empowers Somali institutions and citizens.
Not undermines them.
Critically, not at the expense of the public's will or their elected representatives. It's about supporting the dismounting, not trying to get the dead horse back on its feet, letting it finally rest.
Which brings us towards the end of this deep dive and the paper's conclusion. It sounds like it presents a pretty stark choice.
It really does. The paper sums it up by saying Somali citizens, through registration, and the parliament, through law, have made their choice internally.
The ballot box. Direct democracy.
Yes. That's the path chosen from within, according to the source. And now, the paper argues, the international community faces its own stark and unambiguous decision.
Okay, what are the two paths it lays out?
Path 1. Genuinely support Somalia's move to accountable, people-driven governance. That means accepting the dead horse is dead and backing the new direction.
And path 2.
Path 2 is keep trying to protect the old model, keep pushing for elite deals, recycling old figures, often using terms like inclusivity or consensus in ways that, the paper argues, empower the unelected.
And the consequence of Path 2?
According to the source, continued stagnation, dependency, failure to build stable, legitimate government.
Right.
The paper's final message is pretty clear. There's no neutral ground here. Sticking to the old ways, even partially, actively holds Somalia back from the future it's trying to build for itself.
It certainly leaves you thinking, especially about that line between constructive international partnership and interference, particularly when a nation seems to be asserting its own path based on its own internal processes and public demand. How do external actors balance principles like inclusivity with respecting democratic mandates that emerge from within?
It's a complex challenge, highlighted very sharply by this analysis.
Indeed. A really fascinating, if stark, perspective from this source. That concludes our deep dive for today.